Hey, it's Liberty, and today we're going to be talking about the godfather of Gothic fiction, the daddy of Gothic fiction, whichever you'd prefer. I'm going to be talking about the first novel to call itself Gothic, which is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. If you are a history buff, you may know Horace Walpole for his letters, his politics, his political family, or if you like to visit old buildings, you might have visited Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, which is a Gothic haven. In fact, he was inspired to write this novel because he was waking up in Strawberry Hill after having, a nightmare about a giant hand. Without this novel, the Gothic tradition, as we know it today, would not exist. If you are a fan of the Gothic, then do let me know what your favourite novel is. If you like this, do give it a thumbs up. I make loads of videos about books, history, culture, etc. So do check those out and subscribe if you would like to. And if you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, the link is in the description. I like to put things into context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gothic. It's a concept that kind of seeped into every fibre of society, from literature to politics to architecture to history. Feel free to skip this if you just want the book review. So who are the Goths? They were members of a Germanic tribe who crossed the River Danube into the Roman Empire in 376 AD. They battled with everyone for a while. They sacked Rome in 410 AD, led by Alaric, and occupied and ruled areas from, Italy to Spain. Jordanes, I think that's how you pronounce it, he was a Gothic historian, and he developed this mythology of the Goths, which was that they came from the north, from an island called Skansta, I think. Not unlike Britain, they migrated to Eastern Europe and from there westwards. These people came from a rugged landscape in the north, contrasted with the sort of civilized Mediterranean cultures of the Romans. The Gothic became associated with, brutishness, vulgarity, as opposed to sort of educated and refined Romans. Their reputation as the destroyers of the Roman Empire has lasted throughout the centuries. In England, the reframing of the Goths happened as a result, partly of the English Reformation. Historian William Camden, who wrote the sort of first survey of the British Isles that included history, geography all together, argued that the Goths were an ancient people who resisted any foreign yoke. They were survivors of the imperialist expansion and rebelled against tyranny in the name of liberty, ending the brutal Roman Empire. No, you're not the only one that sees the link between that and Brexit and Henry's break with Rome. It's all connected. The Goths were sort of placed as the ancestors of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, from which the sort of English descend. In the mid-17th century, people started looking to the Anglo-Saxon period to find an alternative to the monarchy, and by the 18th century, a political party, the Whig Party, were formed around the idea of a Gothic polity, essentially, a government of freedmen who resist the arbitrary power of the monarchy. They were formed to sort of oppose the Tory party, who were, monarchical, etc., etc. The Whigs' Gothic constitution was founded on the right of freedom and resistance to tyranny. Walpole was a Whig politician. His father was a Whig prime minister. He's very, very in that world. The Magna Carta, the Civil War, the Protestant Reformation, and the Glorious Revolution were all retrospectively fit into this political narrative and Gothic identity. This established Britain as the constitutional monarchy that we are today and solidified the power of Parliament, pretty much. It's worth noting that despite his Whiggish tendencies, parliamentary supremacy aside, essentially, Walpole did criticise the Reformation and the Civil War in regards to the destruction of ancient monuments. In the architecture too, there was very much a revisionist thought of tracing a common Gothic thread back through time from the megaliths of Stonehenge, through to what they called the modern Gothic of medieval architecture, all those churches and stuff. It's hard to reconcile that with the iconoclasm from the Protestant Reformation, so it was sort of necessary to explain that. Yeah, noble stand against tyranny, there you go. It's pretty easy, you just shove it in everywhere. Medieval chivalry, duels, chess, they were all retroactively described as Gothic and fit into this sort of English national identity. Nick Groom, who did the introduction to Castle of Otranto edition that I read, he talks about an aesthetic of ruin that emerged from this period. He described the superstitious imagination of the people populated all its architectural wreckage with ghosts, the revenants of a Catholic medieval past, vengeful spirits, shadowy monks and nuns, uncanny manifestations. He talks about how the Gothic imagination rose from the ashes of this architecture and the violence of all of the sort of social and political changes that the country went through. Horace Walpole, for example, and Strawberry Hill is the perfect example of Gothic revival architecture. I talked a lot about the sublime in one of my Jane Eyre shorts, so I'm just going to insert a clip here. The sublime, according to ancient Greek writer Longinus, is an aesthetic that was characterised by power, dramatic scenery, and the extremeness of the natural world. It was something that aroused emotion. In the 18th and 19th century, the sublime was often to be found in landscape paintings. Artists such as Caspar David Friedrich employed this technique, often by taking things that weren't in the same image and painting them together. And these paintings capture a sort of greatness that is almost incomprehensible to us as human beings and fills us with awe and terror. It makes humans seem like very small things in comparison to the wildness of nature. We are not in control of it, unlike a sort of perfectly painted landscape that you might see. A farming scene, for example, from Constable. So now I've put the Gothic into a social, political, religious context. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about Horace. Horace Walpole was born in September 1717. He was the son of the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, who we most commonly refer to, Sir Robert Walpole. Indeed, to this day, he's still our longest serving Prime Minister for 20 years or something. As other people of his ilk, Horace went from Eton to Cambridge. His father gave him some minor jobs to do, and then he did the grand tour of Europe. His relationship with his mother was one of the most important relationships in his life, and her death when he was 20 years old was a sort of huge psychological trauma for him. He had a long political career. He was a member of Parliament, very into local Norfolk politics. His first constituency was a rotten borough of Callington in Cornwall. A rotten borough is essentially a constituency where there was a really small electorate due to depopulation of an area, for example. If an MP was for that area, they had a disproportionate, unrepresentative influence in the House of Commons. Obviously, the Reform Act of 1832 would kind of clean this up a little bit. So he was elected in 1741 and he held that seat for 13 years. He became an MP right before his father fell from power, and Horace was part of the family discussion where they had to be Robert, you kind of need to resign now. And his maiden speech was even there was a debate going on about whether or not to set up a secret committee to investigate his father's last 10 years as Prime Minister, which obviously he spoke against that. He spent the next few years with his father at the sort of Walpole family pile. His father died in 1745 and that left Horace with significant debt. In his political career, he was very pro-abolition of slavery. He was against giving Catholics the right to vote. He was very a Whig of his era. His political opponents threw around words like hermaphrodite horse or effeminate to describe him. He was known of having a lot of unconsummated flirtations with women that he could not possibly marry, many of whom have been speculated to be lesbians, but also many of his biographies theorise that he was not homosexual but asexual. He never married and was called a natural celibate by one biographer. I bring that up because actually asexuality is not something that we hear of a lot when it comes to historical figures. His epic Gothic home at Strawberry Hill, which he started building in 1749, was also regularly hosting the Blue Stockings, which were founded in the 1750s, and it was a discussion group and a book club essentially. It promoted women's education, social advocacy. Both men and women attended these meetings. They very much laid the groundwork for the women's movement that would come in the next century. Mary Wollstonecraft was a blue stocking, as was author Fanny Burney, Samuel Johnson. He had his own printing press at Strawberry Hill as well, the Strawberry Hill Press. He was very prolific. As a good Whig politician dedicated to parliamentary democracy, he had a copy of the Magna Carta hung up in his house and a copy for the warrant of the execution of Charles I. His next constituency that he was MP for in 1754 was another rotten borough, but this time it was in Norfolk, Castle Rising, so a little bit closer to home. Then something interesting happened. Horace's uncle died, and Horace's cousin inherited the baronetcy of Walpole. This is 1757. So he was set to enter in the House of Lords, and his cousin was an MP for King's Lynn, and the people of King's Lynn didn't want a stranger representing them, and they wanted someone from the Walpole family. So the new Lord Walpole, he wrote to his cousin Horace to say, look, these people want a Walpole MP. Can you stand in the election? So he did, and he won, and he sat there as an MP until he retired from politics in 1768. Fun fact, his neighbour and close friend in Twickenham, Henrietta Howard, her father was a previous MP for King's Lynn. His name was Sir Henry Hobart, and he died in a duel. If I keep going down these rabbit holes, I will never get to the book review, but he's look. Horace's memoirs and letters are a significant resource for historians. Such a prolific writer, and, for George in England, there's no one better. He coined the word serendipity. He also coined the phrase, "This world is a comedy to those that think, a tragedy to those that feel." Now I'm going to get onto the book. This is what you've been waiting for. So I'm going to talk a bit about the prefaces, because the preface to the first edition says that the book was found in the library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England in 1529 in black letter, which is like the typeface that was used for Bibles, and it was very much associated with antiquity. It's giving the Blair Witch Project. The preface implies that it's set in like the 13th century in Italy, but then other things indicate a little bit further on. It's deliberately done like that. Walpole's author, William Marshall, was translating the work of an Italian author, and there's a lot of talk about in this preface about how it follows the rule of the drama, Aristotle's rule of the drama, stating that the moral of the narrative is that the sins of the father are visited on their children to the third and fourth generation. The first edition was received very well by critics as like this translation, with some referring to Walpole as an ingenious translator. There's also the declaration that the piety that reigns throughout, the lessons of virtue that are inculcated, and the rigid purity of the sentiments exempt this work from the censure to which romances are all too liable. Romances at the time were thought to inflame the imagination and disorder the reason. Samuel Johnson, who was a writer and arguably named the most distinguished man of letters in English history, he claimed that his inability to settle on one particular career was because he read too many novels. There's also a statement that, no doubt that this was a real place. He didn't realise Otranto is actually a real place and there is a castle there. When the book became successful, like the local people sent him a print of the castle, which he also hung in Strawberry Hill. And do go and visit Strawberry Hill. I haven't visited yet. I really need to. In the preface to the second edition, also, Walpole acknowledges himself as the author of the work. He calls it a Gothic story. This is the first time that word's been used. Obviously, this affected how people received the book. It was received a lot worse when people found out that this was someone writing right now. He talked about how this novel was his attempt of blending the two kinds of romance, the ancient and the modern. In the former was all imagination and improbability. In the latter, nature is always intended to be, and sometimes has been, copied with success. Sort of blend of the realistic and the imaginative. This combination of like fantastic and natural. Walpole set the template that would become Gothic over the next couple hundred years. The preface ends after like a long discussion of Voltaire and Shakespeare, which I won't get into. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little synopsis. Be warned, this is quite a detailed synopsis. So the novel starts with a wedding. Manfred, who's the Prince of Otranto, he has one daughter, Matilda, who's 18, literally described as a beautiful virgin, who her father shows zero affection to, and a son, Conrad, who's just turned 15. He's quite sickly, but obviously he's a boy, so he's the apple of his father's eye. He's marrying Conrad off to Isabella, who is the daughter of the Marquis of Venice. His wife, Hippolyta, has disappointed him, just providing him with the 2 children and 1 boy, so he kind of has to marry his son off as quickly as possible so that he can have kids and the line can continue. Because there is an ancient prophecy that the castle and the lordship of Otranto should pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. Everyone's waiting inside the church for Conrad when someone comes running in screaming about Helmet and the prince. So Manfred runs outside. His son is dead. He's been crushed by a giant helmet with a plumage of black feathers on it. Seeing this, the first words out of Manfred's mouth is, "Take care of the Lady Isabella." So she's bundled off to her rooms. She's sad about Conrad, but indifferent for herself. This was marriage of convenience, but she's terrified of Manfred's temper. He's fuming. A peasant from the next village over kind of says, "Hey, this kind of looks like the helmet from the black marbled figure of the former Prince Alfonso the Good that is in the church of St. Nicholas, which is next door," which enrages Manfred even further, and he immediately seizes the youth and is talking about executing him. In the meantime, people have gone to observe and come back to report that indeed the helmet is missing from the statue in the church. Manfred then declares that this boy is clearly a necromancer and has killed his son. Perfectly reasonable explanation. So he's held prisoner under the mask, and we sort of get back to the domestics. Matilda is trying to console her father, who is told, "Begone, I do not want a daughter." Then goes to her mother, and her mother declares that she loves her husband more than her children, so poor Matilda. Isabella is summoned from the ladies to see Manfred, and he curses his wife, declaring that he would divorce his wife and marry Isabella himself because, Henry VIII coded he must have sons. At this point, something is on her side. Manfred rose to pursue her when the moon, which was now up, gleamed in at the opposite casement, presented to his sight the plumes of the fatal helmet, which rose to the height of the windows, waving backwards and forwards in a tempestuous manner. Not only that, but the portrait of Manfred's grandfather gets out of the painting, and Manfred asks, why are you working against your descendant, who so dearly pays for, and then we never find out what he's paying for. The portrait leaves the room and Isabella flees. She doesn't really know where to go. She remembers there's an underground passage from the castle to the church of St. Nicholas, so she grabs a lamp and heads there. The scene of her moving through the passage with wind around her and weird noises, doors opening and closing by themselves. You can see it so easily in your mind. She finds the room with the entrance to the passage, and obviously the wind has blown her lamp out, so she's kind of like in the dark trying to find the thing, and the peasant youth who was trapped under the mask, the helmet crashed through the floor, and so he was able to shimmy into this room. He helps her find the door. A ray of moonshine streaming through a cranny of the ruin above shone directly onto the lock they sought. So Isabella gets through the trapdoor. Manfred arrives before the youth can join her. The youth seems to be very honourable and honest. He tells Manfred exactly what happened with the trapdoor. He doesn't know the castle. He obviously leaves out Isabella because, he's noble. At one point in this interaction, Manfred thinks about himself when he's referring to the youth. Manfred was not one of those savage tyrants who wanton in cruelty unprovoked. To which I wrote, what do you mean? Inside my book. His virtues were always ready to operate when his passion did not obscure his reason. We get the introduction of these two characters, Diego and Jacques, and what follows is a conversation that is straight out of one of Shakespeare's comedies, but eventually they reveal that in the gallery they saw a giant in armour which rattled when it moved. They could only see the arm and the legs. It was lying down. It was so big. Manfred goes with the youth to go and check it out, and he goes to Hippolyta, first time since their son died, asking about Isabella, and runs off to find her. The giant could not be verified by anyone in the meantime, and the youth has been securely locked in a chamber. Manfred retires. Chapter 2 starts with Matilda being completely freaked out. Bianca, who's her maid, comes and fills her in on everything that's going on. Isabella's flight, the youth's arrest, the giant leg and foot. They talk about the idea of Matilda being married, and we get this interesting acknowledgement from Bianca that there is no winning for Matilda, because she wants her to be a lady and not shut herself away in a convent and get married, but also that all men use their wives so when they are weary of them. They talk about, Matilda finding a man who looks just like Alfonso, with Matilda saying, the character of that virtuous prince, the veneration with which my mother has inspired me for his memory, all have concurred to persuade me that somehow or other my destiny is linked with something related to him. Matilda hears a voice, and being persuaded that it is not a ghost, opens the window and has a conversation with the youth who is locked in the chamber underneath. Bianca is convinced that he's in love, specifically with Isabella, but Matilda says, though he said he was unhappy, it does not follow that he must be in love. Think of all that has happened today and tell me if there are no misfortunes but what love causes. Matilda offers to be his protectress, directing him to Father Jerome at the church. Matilda is adorable. She sees the best in everybody. This man that she's never met, she sees the best in Isabella, who she finds out has taken sanctuary in the church. Jerome, meanwhile, at the church, is speaking to Manfred and Hippolyta, and he brings a message to them from Isabella, which is the only comparison I have to what he was repeating her saying. It's like an early day motion from the UK Parliament that MPs sign to show their support for a cause. I'll put an example up here. It's this kind of language. She asks leave to remain in sanctuary until she can leave, basically. Manfred is not having any of it, and he demands her back, and Jerome really stands his ground. Manfred really has a go at Jerome after Hippolyta leaves, demanding that convince Hippolyta to divorce him and marry him to Isabella, for the good of Otranto, obviously. Jerome is not having any of it, and he uses the youth to sort of sow seeds of jealousy in Manfred, being like, maybe, and to throw things off Isabella as well, which was the wrong idea. The youth continues to be the honest, noble person that he is, tells that he's from the next village. He's never seen Isabella before yesterday. Matilda is walking by and hears his gallant words. His person was noble, handsome and commanding, even in that situation, but his countenance soon engrossed her whole care. Bianca soon points out the similarity between the youth and the portrait of Alfonso in the gallery. Manfred decides to execute him to send a message to Isabella, and on hearing this, Matilda faints, and Bianca shouts out, "The princess is dead!" very unhelpfully. The youth, on the other hand, he's resigned to his death, and he asks for confession. Jerome is distraught because he feels responsible, and the youth is none other than Theodore, who is Jerome's son. Plot twist. And nobility, because Jerome reveals that before he was a priest, he was the Count of Falconara, and he starts to plead for the life of the son that he's just met for the first time. They're trying to exchange all this information, father and son. Theodore has to explain I'm sorry, my mother is dead. But he's still so kind. He's just trying to get Manfred to save Isabella this entire time. But this is a scene straight out of a soap opera or a Shakespeare comedy. Like, trumpets sound and the plumes on the helmet like get up and bow. Manfred is freaked out by this. Jerome uses this chance to like try and gain some clemency for his son. He goes to the gate and he finds out the person is the Knight of the Gigantic Sabre, demanding to speak to the usurper of Otranto in the name of Frederick, the Marquis of Venice, who's Isabella's father, who claims that he is the rightful owner of Otranto by blood. Again, you can see why this match happened. Jerome is informed that rumours are spreading that Hippolyta is dead, probably thanks to Bianca, and Isabella is subsequently missing. Understandably, she'd be freaked out by that. Manfred welcomes the knights in, which is like a comically large number of knights. Every sentence there were like more people. 100 gentlemen bearing an enormous sword and seeming to faint under the weight of it. The man on horseback has a banner with the arms of Vincenzo and Otranto on them, which enrages Manfred. As he approaches, a wind blows the plumes of the giant helmet as they did before. He gives them a tour, opens up his home to these people, and by this point it does not surprise Manfred in the slightest when they return to the courtyard and the sword is on its own, stands up, and then it falls to lie next to the helmet. Manfred reveals, his claim to Otranto, and his grandfather was bequeathed it by Alfonso because he was childless at his death. He tells everyone about Conrad's death coming at a time when he was so agonised about the legality of his marriage. Instead of taking Isabella away, perhaps she could marry me and restore the line of Alfonso through this marriage. Jerome arrives unhelpfully and announces Isabella's flight to the whole room, and when the chief knight demands an explanation, Manfred fibs that he placed Isabella in sanctuary, and Jerome is too terrified to contradict him, and so the knights sort of go after him, with Manfred privately trying to secure the knight's company to ensure that he can't find her. Matilda runs off to the tower and lets Theodore go. Theodore falls in love with first sight with Matilda, asking her to run away with him, which, obviously there's a bunch of misunderstandings about who is who and who did what, but they figure out that he is the one who helped Isabella. She takes him to the gate and falls to his feet, declaring that he will return knighted and swear himself to her service. Matilda, closing it, put an end to the interview, in which the hearts of both had drunk so deeply of a passion which both now tasted for the first time. Theodore goes to the church, and gallant man that he is, goes off to find Isabella. The idea of Matilda had imprinted itself so strongly on his heart, he could not bear to absent himself at much distance from her abode. He goes to the forest that Matilda sort of told him to go hide in, and he's in these caves. He sought the gloomiest shades as best suited to the pleasing melancholy that reigned in his mind. Supposedly these caves are haunted, and he finds Isabella and reassures her he's not turning her over to Manfred, as, he puts her in a cave and he's like, I'm gonna guard the entrance. There, he runs across, he leaves her saying, don't worry, my heart's promised to another, I'm not gonna touch you. And then he goes and he meets the mounted knight, the big knight, and they don't talk to each other about what they're doing, about what's going on. They just fight each other, and Theodore wounds the knight, who turns out is Isabella's father, Frederick. So they all return to the castle so he can be treated. Everyone meets back at the castle, and Matilda is jealous seeing Isabella and Theodore together. Theodore keeps looking at Matilda, but she can't meet his eyes, and Isabella is looking at Theodore. Frederick reveals that while he was held captive in Palestine, he dreamed that his daughter was in danger. So when his ransom was paid, he fled to a wood that he saw in his dream and met a hermit there who directed him and his men to a tree where they dug up the giant sabre. And the message on the sabre read, "Where'er a casque that suits this sword is found, with perils is thy daughter compassed round. Alfonso's blood alone can save the maid, and quiet a long restless prince's shade." A casque is a helmet. Manfred comes in, and seeing Theodore dressed in armour, he thinks he's Alfonso for a second, and he's missed a lot, Manfred. Theodore tells the story that he and his mother were abducted by pirates when he was 5 from Sicily to Algiers. She had died, and she had left him a note saying, "You're the son of the Count of Falconara." So when a Christian ship rescued him 2 years ago, he went home and tried to find his father, but obviously, the lands had been ravaged. His father, he heard, was in Naples as a priest, so he goes to find him. He has found the father-son reconciliation that he was looking for. The party disperses, and Matilda and Isabella, they're both thinking about Theodore. Matilda is such a girl's girl. She's like, Isabella met him first. She's been saved by him twice. He might have just been looking at me to distract from Isabella. Isabella, on the other hand, is regretting trying to talk her out of becoming a nun and resolves to convince her. But she remembers, what has just happened and says, "If you still retain the friendship for me that you have vowed from your infancy, you will detest a man who has been on the point of making me miserable forever." They both start talking about how they're so convinced that Theodore likes the other one and how much they both like Theodore, and this scene does not pass the Bechdel test. And then Isabella remembers that, Theodore had basically told her that he likes Matilda. Hippolyta joins them and she says, look, I'm divorcing Manfred. Isabella's going to marry him. And Matilda, you're now going to marry Frederick. And Isabella is not having any of this. Force should not drag me to Manfred's hated bed. I loathe him. Divine and human laws forbid. Matilda's a bit more obedient. She says she'll do her best to avoid Theodore, but she really is pleading to not marry anyone else. Meanwhile, in the church, Jerome is annoyed to hear that his son has feelings for Matilda and tells him to stay away from her. But Theodore was basically like, I just met this guy and I really love Matilda, so I'm not going to do that. Jerome even says, it is sinful to cherish those whom heaven has doomed to destruction. A tyrant's race must be swept from the earth to the third and fourth generation. Theodore replies that the fair Matilda has virtues enough, and Jerome quickly says, to undo thee. Hippolyta arrives to ask for Jerome's advice. Manfred proposes the double marriage, Matilda and Frederick, him and Isabella. At the thought of Matilda, Frederick forgets that he hates Manfred and sees himself like succeeding to Otranto through marriage. Manfred heads to the church and finds Hippolyta being counselled by Jerome not to divorce. Manfred gets a scolding from the priest, declaring that Manfred is no lawful prince. On declarations of his intentions to Jerome of like the double marriage, blood falls from the nose of Alfonso's statue that's in the church. At this point, Manfred is convinced that there is something going on between Isabella and Theodore, and that the timing of Frederick and Theodore arriving so close together suggests conspiracy. Manfred runs into Bianca and has a very Shakespearean conversation with her. She's sent off to investigate a potential romance there. She's not gone very long, though, before she returns to interrupt Manfred and Frederick, declaring that a giant hand was there in the castle. Frederick puts the pieces together, the giant sabre, the giant body parts. It's a sign against Manfred's lie. The group gather for the most awkward dinner ever, which is enough to make Frederick do his 10th U-turn and decide he is going to marry Matilda after all. So he goes to find Hippolyta to see if she will consent to a divorce. He sees someone hunched over in her little oratory where she would be praying, but it wasn't Hippolyta, but a skeleton who says, "Wast thou delivered from bondage to pursue carnal delights?" That's him told, so he goes to bed. Manfred, flushed by wine and love, had come to seek him and proposed to waste some hours of the night in music and revelling. Manfred is completely sinking in the thoughts of Isabella and Theodore, that they're meeting to conspire. Obviously he's drunk and he heard someone tells him that Theodore is meeting a woman in the church, so he's furious and he goes there. He sees Theodore is talking to a woman and he stabs this woman in the heart. Turns out it was Matilda. He's just killed his own daughter. Matilda is the epitome of the devoted daughter, and she sort of brings everyone together at her death, or tries to. Theodore is obviously distraught. He had tried to get his father to marry the two of them before she died, but to no avail, and she dies. The castle walls quite literally come down, and the giant statue of Alfonso that has been haunting the castle appears with a clap of thunder and a rattle of armour, declaring Theodore is the natural heir. We find out that Manfred's forebear, convinced Alfonso to name him heir. He was his chamberlain or something. And Jerome tells his story. Manfred gives up his title to Theodore, and both he and Hippolyta are going to retire to a religious house. Theodore and Isabella marry, though Theodore still loves and grieves Matilda, but Isabella's the only one who can kind of understand his sorrow. And thus ends the first Gothic novel. That was Castle of Otranto. This novel is short but packs a punch. I really enjoyed it. Very difficult to review this book against other books in its genre because it is its genre. It's the origin of so many Gothic tropes that we now know and love. It's the first of its kind. Very innovative. Obviously, to me, it wasn't a scary read as it would have been to someone at the time, but it's full of suspense and it got me gripped, and I truly didn't know what was going to happen next. It's 100-something pages, but it's packed full. Big important things are happening in one sentence. Hence why my synopsis is so long for such a short book. You kind of have to be paying attention to every word. The whole plot takes place in a few days. Some tropes we see include mistaken identity, hidden identities such as secret nobles, haunted castles, secret passageways, ancestral curses, talking skeletons, damsels in distress, people who are thought dead, who were not dead, many, many more. This novel is very much showing us of what people at the time thought about medieval Europe. Like I said, we're looking 12th, 13th, 14th century for the setting, and someone looking back from the 18th century. It's sort of an attempt to write a medieval romance / Shakespearean fanfic with a modern realistic sensibility. It's very melodramatic. The way that this novel is laid out was really interesting. There is no speech marks and it's very dialogue heavy, and there is so much also non-dialogue that reads sometimes like stage directions almost. Like it felt at times like I was reading a play. Dashes are used to separate between like two different people talking. It took a second to get used to the way that it was all laid out. Walpole's style is really to the point. It's the opposite of like stylistic flowery prose. Despite that, it's, yeah, like I was saying, it's very theatrical. One could even say camp. The influence from Shakespeare in its more, well, in every aspect really is kind of obvious. It is sort of like a Shakespearean fan fiction, tragedy, comedy. All the misunderstandings are very Shakespeare coded. The scene with like Diego and Manfred and Bianca and Manfred, like the domestic staff that bring the comedic element sometimes when the nobles are sort of dealing with the sort of like tragedy and everything. To a modern reader, obviously because of the way that subsequent people have really run with a lot of these tropes in this novel, like going back and reading this book sometimes feels like reading a pantomime almost. Like some of the more terrorizing moments I was finding quite funny. But also I think like Walpole is so cognizant of his influence from Shakespeare, it's hard to think that it's not intentional also. Like it was meant to be a tragic comedy. He talks in the preface of Shakespeare's mastery of both comedy and tragedy, and he makes it clear, like I was saying earlier, it's, you know, dramatic structure. He's blended all of these elements, you know, fantasy and supernatural and comedy and tragedy, like to make this. And yeah, obviously we know mistaken identity is a huge thing in Shakespeare, and misunderstandings, and quite a few of them have quite deadly consequences. The use of dramatic irony is bravo. Manfred has no problem saying he's going to divorce his wife for being related to him, yet will happily marry someone who is engaged to his son and who considers him and his wife to be like parental figures. Matilda is out there falling in love with the man who's going to cause the end of her family. Jerome sets Manfred's eye on his son Theodore without knowing Theodore is his son. Like Theodore vows to defend Isabella and ends up wounding her father. Like when you think about it, actually, Jerome is responsible unknowingly for a lot of what goes on. The structure of this novel is also very interesting to me, like the slow reveals, the drips and drabs of all the information that is required for you to like slowly piece the puzzle together. We skip to different places for events happening concurrently. We skip forwards and backwards. It's like this book really keeps you on your toes. Something that jumps off the page is the sense of justice and righting wrongs that characterize obviously like this book. Despite all the churches that Manfred's family have built to appease God, they cannot fight the prophecy and the eventual dispersal of their line. You know, the descendants paying for the sins of their ancestors, we heard this in the preface. The supernatural elements were done in a really evocative way. There are a few things I want to talk about regarding this. The first is the castle itself. It's crumbling very much in the style of the post-Reformation buildings that I was talking about in the Gothic section. Walpole is very much invoking the violent turbulence of the time, which is obviously further ruined by the events of the novel. Walpole also used all the senses to sort of terrorize the characters, especially sound. That was done really well. The use of thunder at very significant moments, signifying the heavens' judgment of the events, and specifically surrounding Theodore as and then he eventually takes his place as the true ruler. There's also like the rattling of the armor of the, you know, the suit of armor that is the harbinger of misfortune. Physical darkness as well, like a lack of sight, is used to not only reflect the evil that is seeping into Manfred's heart for everything that he's doing as the story is progressing, but also kind of reflects how people are acting with no idea of foresight of the consequences of what they are doing and saying. You know, again, bring that back, that dramatic irony. The giant statue of Alfonso also very much looms over everyone. His legacy looms over everyone as they seek to prove their connection to him, as well as literally looming over people in the form of like various body parts and armor. And this is, you know, the supernatural element of the story that has a physical role in the story. It ends Manfred's line, becoming a physical manifestation of the revenge and the ancestral curse as it kills Conrad. It's huge, like no one can escape him. It protects Theodore in various ways and marks him as Alfonso's successor. The dead has risen and are making their feelings known. Something I also found really interesting is that Jerome and the other churchmen, like they don't really react that much to the supernatural events going on. Manfred has a greater reaction to them, but also like all of these things are happening. He's got a one-track mind. He just wants to get his divorce and he wants to marry Isabella. Like that's, you know, the religious struggles are sort of kept to the female characters, specifically Hippolyta and Matilda. Obviously this book is very plot driven and the characters are a whole range of different levels of interesting. There's, you know, Theodore, who is very noble and honest, and if he does bad things, it's by accident. Like he's kind of early Marvel Captain America, like the noble young peasant you see pop up across Gothic literature. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Manfred, who is like all selfishness. He's the, you know, the archetype of the Gothic villain. the tyrant. And in Manfred, we see sort of toxic masculinity personified. Like, I brought up Henry VIII, he's Henry VIII coded, but also closeted right-wing politician coded. Maybe? His violent reaction to Theodore, who is a physical manifestation of his power being taken from him, certainly feeds into that. Arguably, he's the character that we follow the most. It's his story, but he is the antagonist. The man ruled by his passions who abandons Christianity, the law, and his own family to pursue his own ends. A quote I love is like, Manfred could not support this act of pathetic piety. He dashed himself on the ground and cursed the day he was born. Like, it's so dramatic. In terms of the female characters, we get a sort of a smaller spectrum. At one end is Hippolyta and Isabella is at the other. Both Hippolyta and Matilda they're very religious women. They're kind of obedient and kind and loving. Hippolyta, when talking to Matilda and Isabella, at one point says, "It is not ours to make election for ourselves. Heaven, our fathers, and our husbands must decide for us." Hippolyta's devotion drives all of her decisions in the novel. She puts Manfred over God at one point, and it's not until it's too late that she and Matilda really have this sort of like moment of mother-daughter clarity. Matilda's conflict is her obedience to her parents versus, the desires of her own heart, but her obedience wins out most of the time. And, she has conflicts about it, obviously, and we'll never know if she would have had that final rebellion. She's a character that I would have loved to have seen, I guess, treated with a little bit more nuance. But to counter them, arguably you could say Jerome as well, but I think Isabella is one of the most complex characters in this whole book. She's kind of the most modern character that we get. Interestingly, she's also the one who's least influenced by parental authority because her mother died in childbirth and her father has been fighting off in the Crusades since she was born. And obviously this novel is all about the idea of like generational curses and paying for the sins of your ancestors. She openly acknowledges that her marriage to Conrad is a political one. She openly declares her disdain for Manfred. She almost gives in to her temptation to keep information from Matilda about Theodore that would keep them apart and, maybe give Isabella a chance with Theodore. And she even like at one point resents the warmth in Theodore's voice that she perceives as being directed towards Matilda. Like she even thinks about persuading Matilda to go into a nunnery. But ultimately, her love and her friendship for Matilda, wins out. Obviously, like I said, this is kind of told with Manfred. This is the main character. But if this was being written or made into a film today, like the best way to do it is through the eyes of Isabella. Like this is her wedding that has been interrupted by the death of her fiance. Like she's the one who's put in danger. She's the one who has to get herself out of the mess that she's in. At the end of the day, these two people who she considered parents have abandoned her. Her own father is like agreeing to this double marriage. He no longer is considering her. Like she truly is like on her own. The only person she even has is Matilda, and then Matilda dies. And then she gets stuck married to a man who doesn't love her. It's not only a tragedy for the people who had died, but it's a tragedy for everybody who kind of gets left behind. The only people who are kind of unscathed, no one is unscathed, but apart from Jerome, I guess. He finds out that his wife is dead, but it's been years. He's been reunited with his son. He's fine. So if you are a fan of Gothic literature, it is well worth reading the book that really spawned a whole genre. There's romance, drama, comedy, supernatural, horror. It kind of has it all. And without this book, we wouldn't have Wuthering Heights, we wouldn't have Frankenstein, Dracula, any of the titans. I had a great time reading it, and it's a shame that this was Horace Walpole's only novel. He's written extensively in non-fiction, but there's so much more I could say about this, but this is probably way too long already, so I am gonna leave it at that. But yeah, that was my review of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. Thank you for watching. This is a mammoth one. I hope you enjoyed it. Do let me know your thoughts. Have you read this book? Do you want to read this book? If you have any good Gothic classic recommendations, do drop them in the comments. And yeah, if you like this, do give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you would like to. Happy reading!